Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
David sent me a story based in Michigan. He said, hey, I think you like this one, but I like it for a whole bunch of other reasons too, some of which I'll get to. But from MLive, and this is a story about a fish wholesaler who ran afoul of the law. Michigan fish wholesaler who bought 50,000 pounds of illegal trout gets reduced sentence. And Brandon Champion wrote the story again for MLive. And of course, the first thing that occurs to you is, what is an illegal trout? What is an illegal trout? And it's just the context that makes it sound funny. It's a very interesting story, but it brings back some memories. Charlevoix, Michigan. And again, Michigan is shaped like this, and Charlevoix is up in this area. That area. I know it's hard to be specific as to which pinky and which corner of which finger I'm pointing to, but trust me, us Michiganians know. A fish wholesaler in northern Michigan has caught a break after feds were unable to set up his unusual jail sentence. So the man was going to get sentenced to jail, and because they couldn't do what they agreed to do, he's going to get a break. The Associated Press reports that John Cross III of Charlevoix will serve 4 months of home detention without an electronic tether instead of the year in jail that he was supposed to get at his sentencing. And that's what they told him back in April of last year. He pleaded guilty to buying 50,000 pounds of lake trout from fishermen using trap nets. Those fish should have been thrown back into the water. Federal officials had planned to allow Cross to serve 3 to 4 months at a time outside the fishing season, but the sentence has been thrown out because the U.S. Bureau of Prisons questioned the legality of an intermittent sentence, meaning that you can't go to prison, get out, go to prison, get out, at least according to their own rules. U.S. District Judge Paul Maloney issued an order saying that he can leave home to go to work during the new 4-month sentence. Cross said he was truly sorry when sentenced to jail time. He's the owner of John Cross Fisheries in Charlevoix. Charlevoix is a beautiful town. If you ever get to Michigan, in the summertime in particular, you go up to Charlevoix, and there's it's right on the lake, of course. It's up here. And I just realized I'm wearing the map on my shirt. And there's a channel that goes into Lake Charlevoix right there, and so there's a marina there. I've got a friend who's got a boat there. I've got friends who've got places up there. Another shirt I often wear on this show is from a restaurant on Lake Charlevoix, which I got last summer. And so it's an interesting story that the guy had apparently got himself a bunch of trout that had been caught illegally. The trout themselves were not illegal. It was the method in which they were captured that was illegal. So he pleaded guilty to that. He'll do some time in intermittent house arrest or something. But it could have been worse, but it worked out for him apparently. So the funny thing is that when David sent me the story, he just said, hey, Steve, Michigan story and the phrase illegal trout might catch your attention. But what it reminded me of is that I don't go fishing these days. I haven't been fishing in years. And I have people occasionally ask me about fishing, and I don't fish. But I used to as a child. And this is one of those things that I've talked before about my paper route that I had as a child. And I had a lot of people weigh in and say, Steve, that reminded me I had a paper route. And my grandparents lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My grandmother, on my mother's side, lived in a little town called Alston. And Alston is the base of the Keweenaw Peninsula, right about there. And if you were to go to a map today and look, Alston is still on the map, but there's not much there as far as the town goes. It's a pretty booming town in the beginning of the 20th century, but it became pretty much of a ghost town. There was an IGA store there for many, many years, and it's gone now. I drove by it 10, 15 years ago now, and it was just the slab was there, but the building was gone. And so the interesting thing, though, is there's a small creek that flowed by the little town of Alston there, and we didn't even know what it was called. As children, we just say, "Oh, we're going to go down to the creek, down to the creek, down to the creek." And in later years, I looked at a map, and I saw that maps did call it the Mill Creek, Mill, M-I-L-L. And there had been shingle mills in and around the area of Alston. In fact, Alston, when it was a booming town, was a place where there was a mill that made shingles. I'm assuming that they're talking about the siding for houses back then, but wood mills. And so along this creek, there were a couple spots where you could see there were walls and caved in portions of old mills. And the creek in the summertime, in the absolute heat of the summertime, was very, very low, meaning that you could walk across at ankle deep water in some places. There might be pools of deeper water. And if you came by earlier in the summer, it would be a little deeper. And of course, in the spring, when the snow was melting, it would be a, deluge. And I can tell you that one year we went up in the wintertime, which we didn't do very often when I was a little kid. My brothers and I went down to the creek, and we were playing around down there, and I fell in. I got a soaker. Upper Peninsula, the woods are this deep in snow, and somehow I miscalculated where the edge of the creek was, and I went in, and I got soaked up to about here. And I remember at the time thinking, like, wow, that's a close call. And I remember walking back to my grandmother's house, half mile, 3/4 of a mile, with my clothing freezing and getting, as I walked along. But in the summertime, my brother and I, in particular my older brother Dave and I, would fish on the river. Now, all of us had fished on the river at one time or another, but we would go fishing because there were trout in that river. And it was interesting because, I know people who get, fishing rods and fishing equipment and stuff, and you don't need that stuff. And especially, and I know this is going to sound a lot like a Tom Sawyer type story, but this is absolutely true. Before we'd go up north, my parents would tell us we're all going up north, the second week of July. My brother and I would go up to the hardware store. There was a hardware store in Birmingham called Maskell's. We'd go up to the hardware store and we'd buy fish hooks, and you'd buy a reel of fishing line. Okay? And that's it. And I had a jackknife, and I'm pretty sure my brother had a pocket knife. And so we would go up Alston, staying at my grandmother's place, and one good morning we'd get up and go, hey, let's go fishing. We're going to go fishing today. And so we'd go walking down the road towards the creek, and on the way, we'd just look along the edge of the woods, and you'd be looking for a branch that was relatively straight that would be easy to cut with a jackknife. And so you'd either find a little sapling about this tall or a branch sticking off a tree, like a birch type tree or something. And you'd cut this off, and it'd be about, that thick at its thickest end, about yay long, right? Cut up both ends, trim off all the leaves and stuff. And you take a piece of line about this long, 3-4 feet long, and you tie one end there, and you tie one end to the little hook. And then the only choice we ever had to make was, we're going to go upstream or downstream. If we went downstream, we'd go along and we'd go past those foundations of the old mills, and eventually the river would come close enough to the road, and we'd pop out on the road and just walk back on the road. Or if we went upstream, it wound back into the woods a little deeper, but it was a little more interesting visually back there. It was a little hillier, and there's a bunch of cool stuff back there, including at one point there was a big embankment they'd put in to allow a railroad to go over the creek, and they'd put a culvert in and then built it up. And where the culvert came out of the other side, there was a pond, culvert pond we called it, and that pond would then flow into the river, and the river would flow down. And if we went upstream, it was a decent hike, and then when we got to the culvert pond, we'd climb the side of the embankment and take the culvert road back, which was actually the old railroad bed. But the tracks were long since gone, but there was, the ties were still there. It was a perfectly straight line, take you right back into downtown Alston, which of course at the time was nothing but an IGA store. And I'm not quite sure, I think it was my grandfather's, but there was one of those things you see like in an LL Bean catalog, and it's made out of like wicker, and it's a little basket with a flap on top that you put fish in when you catch them. And so we'd take that, we'd borrow that from my grandmother, walk down the road, cut our own poles, attach the lines, attach the hooks, and then, of course, anybody will tell you this, you can buy a lure. You can buy bait. The best bait you can buy won't beat the worms you can find at the banks of the river. Go down, flip over rocks, and look for bait. Find some bait, and then all you do, and this is tough for two elementary school, school-aged kids, is you very, very quietly walk along the creek and try to spot a likely place where a trout might be hanging out. And it might be a little pool. There might be a couple logs that are giving some shade to an area. There might just be a little overhang, from where the water's carved into a bank. And all you do is you lower the bait in very, very slowly. And the second you feel something hit it, you yank it and hope that you hook the fish and get the fish out of there. There were a few occasions I remember them well, where you flip it just wrong, and the trout comes up out of the water, and he's not hooked, and right back in the water he's gone. But it's been so long. It's literally been almost 50 years. Almost 50 years. In fact, I was fishing 50 years ago, but the summers I'm thinking of with my brother Dave were probably a couple of years, 49 or 48 years ago. And so I just remember us, doing that entire length of the river and, coming back with 4 or 5 keepers, And it was always an interesting thing. There were also other fish that were not trout. And some of them are just garbage fish. I remember going, you take it and you throw it back in. But I also remember that when you went upstream, I can picture this vividly to this day. You go upstream and the river wound around like a fairly tall, I don't want to call it, like a little bluff, maybe 15 feet high, trees leaning off of it, and the river wound around it, and the river was kind of cutting underneath this, and was causing the bluff to kind of like go over. And at the base of that bluff was a pretty deep pool. And one summer, my brother said, I think there's a trout in there. And every single time we'd come by there and he'd, put it in there. And once or twice we saw him. But he either didn't take the bait or he didn't get hooked. And I seem to recall that a couple days into that vacation, my brother got him. But, those are memories from a long, long time ago. But it's kind of funny because this guy here who got arrested for the illegal trout, 50,000 pounds of illegal trout. It's always disappointing when you see how the adults do it. I look back on that summer fishing with Dave, and you catch a trout and it's big enough to keep. You're like, yes, unbelievable! I caught this. Using my homemade rod and 3 feet of line and a hook. And what's that? Maybe half a pound? I don't know what a single trout weighs. Didn't ever actually weigh him. We measured him. But to hear that some guy's in trouble because he bought 50,000 pounds of illegal trout, that's an industrial quantity of trout, my friends. My brother and I came back with maybe a couple pounds. But we were actually doing it more because it was just fun. 2 kids tramping through the woods. Half the time making a little bit too much noise to be fishing. And I remember every single year before we went up north thinking and talking to Dave and saying, what I want to do is I want to go to like one end and start here and go all the way up to the middle and then from there all the way up here and all these grand plans, and you're out there tramping around in the woods and you're having a good time and you're not really thinking about it that way later on. Once you're there, you're having fun. Who cares? So I just remember the good feeling I had walking down the culvert road or walking back on, I think it was M38, with some trout, saying, we had success out fishing today. And I actually looked at the map today again to confirm that it is called Mill Creek on more than one map, and it is. And Mill Creek flows into the west branch of the Sturgeon River, which then flows into the main branch of the Sturgeon River. Someplace along the line, it joins Otter Lake and then continues thence as the Sturgeon River again. And it flows up to Chassel into the Portage Lake. And Portage Lake, of course, then goes into Lake Superior. So the little creek that my brother and I were fishing on 50 years ago, that water would make it all the way out to Lake Superior and then theoretically all the way out St. Lawrence Seaway and beyond. And it's kind of interesting to think about how all these things are connected together. There you go, 50,000 pounds of illegal trout. Questions, comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Shh, my coffee and I are having a moment. I will deal with you later.